One day. Hi, I'm Rob, Mid-Atlantic District VP for CSLT. Thank you for stopping in for this session of Leadership Academy 2021. We hope you enjoy the great content here, so let's get started.
Some of you may know me. I've been in Mid-Atlantic District, back in Mid-Atlantic District since 2003. I actually joined the society in Mid-Atlantic District in 1977, but then I lived in Canada for almost 20 years. So I've been at Barbershop for 43 years. I'm a CPA by background. 2 years ago, I retired from the Baltimore County Public Library System as the CFO there, and I have a number of other interesting jobs throughout my career. So I have been the treasurer's instructor. I have been a treasurer's instructor since 1999, and I've been essentially the track advisor, which no longer really exists, but when other instructors have questions, they usually give me a call. So I've been informally staying in that role. So that's a little bit about me and about why I'm here. Steve Stojowski, good to see you, my friend. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, it's hard to get that unmuted. I've been a barber shopper about 22 years. I've been a treasurer off and on for 19 years, maybe a dozen times. I've been a secretary twice, and this is the first time I've attended a Treasurer's Leadership Academy since 2002.
Now that's not quite true.
It was time for me to come back.
It's not quite true because you've taught this course.
Oh, a few times, yeah.
Welcome, my friend.
Thank you.
Okay, Dave, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, the unmute shortcut didn't work. Okay, well, I'm going to join your class of 1977 group because that's when I started as well. So I think we're the majority this time. Yeah, treasurer in various titles with the Alexander Harmonizers for the last 17 years. We've restructured in a number of different ways so that the title doesn't always fit, but it's kind of the same job. And district treasurer for the last 2 years. And just to say hi to all the new folks, and you've heard this comment of treasurer for life, don't take it too seriously. The hardest part of this job is getting started. Once you figure it out, it really isn't that hard, and it shouldn't be that hard. And you got plenty of help on this screen right here, particularly John and Steve and I. If you have any questions, between the three of us, we've got answers. And if we don't, we've got a whole pool of other people around the world that can help. So don't be intimidated by that. Now, from a practical perspective, it sometimes feels like it's a job for life because a lot of people don't want to do it. And a lot of the population is math phobic, so that kind of is a hindrance.
Okay, so I'm just going to briefly run through the agenda of what we're going to talk about tonight. What I want to emphasize is that we have a mix of people on the call. We have people who are brand new to the treasurer's position. We have people who have been in the position less than a year. And we have people who have been in the position for 10, 12, 30, 40 years. So some of this will be repetition for some of you, but some of it will be brand new. And I'm going to try and go through the basics, what I call, relatively quickly, because this whole presentation, if you can believe it, used to last about 8 hours over 2 days back before the turn of the century anyway. And now we've compressed it down to about 3 hours. and when it's an in-person presentation, and doing it online kind of makes it even a little more difficult. So hopefully I'm covering most of what you need to know from a basic implementation perspective, and also allow times for you to ask questions and get questions answered. So in the first hour or so, we're going to talk about the chapter and board structure, the treasurer's roles, how to do certain things in terms of the accounting and reporting, basic stuff about the incorporation status, and we'll close out this part of the session with the IRS issues that you need to make sure you're on top of. And again, we'll have questions hopefully answered before we take that break around 8:15. After we come back from our break, we'll talk about the financial review. We'll talk about budgeting and the importance of budgeting even in a pandemic. We'll talk about the software that you are using and maybe would like to change if that's possible or a desire of yours, and we'll talk about some of the differences between Quicken and QuickBooks and some other alternatives. I'll give you a list, or there is a list in the handout of the resources for things that we didn't cover. For example, everyone should have a copy of the Treasurer's Manual, which has I think 7 or 8 chapters that deal with everything from the chart of accounts to the type of reporting to some in-depth IRS issues. So we won't go into that in detail. I will refer to the Treasurer's Manual in this presentation, though, and hopefully we'll end up with some time for questions. So before we begin, let's have some thoughts on the pandemic. I know it's been almost a year since we've had in-person rehearsals, we've had chapter shows and sing-outs. It's awful not being able to see our friends, our singing buddies, and just that social contact every week is agonizing. I know you all feel it, and I know you all want to get back to it as quickly as possible. And there is hope now that people are getting vaccinated, that 2020 at some point will bring most of that back for a lot of us. The good news is apparently you're all here, so your chapter has survived this far. You've been doing something right socially. Hopefully you've been doing something right financially, and you'll emerge from this trying time with the resources needed to carry forward. I will say something that I've told the district and I've told chapters throughout the society as I visited them over the past 9 months. Please encourage your members, when they have the financial means to do it, to renew their membership. It's important to maintain the contact with the chapter, with the district, even with the society. That level of detail and that level of information and the connection that they have through the membership in your chapter and the outreach from someone in your chapter reaching out to them saying, hey, your membership is about to renew, can we count on you, or is there something that we can do to help you? That kind of outreach is really important under the best of circumstances, and it's so much more important now in this kind of environment. So I encourage you, if your chapters are not doing that, to look into it and ask someone to do it. And finally, celebrate the small successes you have, your Zoom meetings, your just whatever successes you have. Celebrate them and take some comfort in that in this time. Okay, so a few thoughts about chapters and board structure. It really is, the board is a team, and the minimum amount of membership in a chapter board is the president, secretary, and treasurer. And these positions are really critical in terms of keeping the chapter smoothly operating. We're going to have a separate session next Sunday night for all of the presidents, secretaries, and treasurers who've been part of these, well, at least the secretaries and treasurers have been part of this, and the presidents can join in as well. And we'll talk more detail about how the roles overlap and how to essentially make sure that the work that needs to be done is being done on a timely basis. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail there. I'm going to focus tonight more on the role of the treasurer, but I do want to say something as a role as a board member. The treasurer is not just the bookkeeper. Your role is a full member of the board. You are part of the decision-making process. You're part of the discussion process. Take that opportunity. Be part of the decision-making process for your chapter. Don't sit off to the side and say, I'm only here to provide the numbers. You're a full member, voting member of the board, and you should take that opportunity to provide the leadership to the chapter, not just in the financial area. But you also have a role as a financial advisor to the chapter. So let's talk a little bit about that. The treasurer's roles come in three main types. The first is as a bookkeeper. You keep accurate records of all income and expense and do bank reconciliations and report to the board and all those kinds of things. Your other roles are as a financial advisor to the chapter, and specifically to the president, in terms of budgeting and long-term planning for the chapter, and also when it comes to major projects, shows, trips, when you're going to purchase new risers or new uniforms or things along those, how you're going to pay for them. So that's an important aspect. And finally, being a compliance officer. There's a lot of regulatory and record-keeping requirements for a chapter, and some of it is the secretary's job, but a lot of it is also the treasurer's job. So that's the three main functions of the treasurer, and let's focus in a little bit on some of that. Obviously, paying bills is a pretty straightforward process. You also reconcile any charges from the society and payments from the society for chapter dues when people renew on the society website. You maintain all the financial data of the chapter for whatever period of time is appropriate. There's a records retention policy recommendation in the chapter treasurer's manual, but a good rule of thumb is to pretty much keep things for 7 years. There are certain things you can keep less than that. It's in the records retention policy, but if you're looking for a general rule of thumb, 7 years is a good time frame. You want to work with the secretary to keep the banking signature authorities up to date. If your president changes or if you have other people who are authorized to sign for the chapter and those roles change on a year-to-year basis, you need to get that updated with the bank if you're still issuing checks. In this day and age, many chapters are making payments through the clearinghouse system or other digital ways, but if you're still writing checks, you do need to maintain that information with the bank. You need to work with the secretary on reconciling renewals and new member remittances, whether they come in through the society or whether they come in through a check that comes into the chapter and then needs to be forwarded. So there's an aspect of working with the secretary on that. You help organize the financial review of the chapter on an annual basis, and we'll get into that in more detail in the second half of the class tonight. You prepare and file IRS and other forms as needed, and you essentially compile the annual budget based on information from the functional VPs of the chapter. And we'll talk budgeting, again, will be hopefully the first topic after the break tonight. And an important part of this treasurer's job is to make sure that the balance of social funds versus operating funds is correct per the IRS regulations. And for the new people, social funds and operating funds, or restricted versus unrestricted funds, it can be a bit of a daunting topic. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes here talking about that in a little bit of detail. When you're talking about restricted versus unrestricted, or social versus social is essentially unrestricted and operating is restricted, you're really talking about the source of the funds. When the money comes from the public, that money is restricted as to its use. It can only be used for purposes related to the mission of the chapter, and it can't be used for essentially the membership, just to provide, say, a party for the membership. You can't use public money, money that comes in from the public, ticket sales, for example, for that. So you have to keep that as part of the restricted funds of the chapter. Now, you don't need to do this in separate bank accounts or even separate chart of accounts. It can be done through tags or project codes in the various accounting software, but it does need to be, the chart of accounts needs to be organized in a way so that the revenue is categorized as restricted or unrestricted. Revenue that comes from donors, if your chapter is lucky enough to have people donating to it, or you're receiving funds from the Barbershop Harmony Society or Harmony Foundation for the Donor's Choice Program, those funds are restricted as well to the mission and purposes of the chapter as a nonprofit organization. In addition, money that comes in from donors may also have purpose restrictions. So if someone gives you a donation and says it's to be used for youth activities, or it's to be used for purchasing new uniforms or something like that, then it has to be used for that purpose. So there are other things beyond possible the mission and of the chapter in terms of the restriction. And finally, there's money that comes from the members, primarily dues, but it could be other activities, payments for afterglows, cast parties, things like that. And that money is what's called unrestricted, and this is the social versus operating. This is the social aspect of the organization that we belong to, that it is recognized that you can spend money on social activities, but it has to be money that comes from the members themselves, not from the general public. To give you a better idea of how all this is organized in the chart of accounts, when you look at the Treasurer's Manual and the chart of accounts, you'll see that the receipt or revenue accounts and the disbursement or expense accounts are organized in very specific categories. And these accounts, you'll see in the Treasurer's Manual, are organized in terms of whether they are restricted or go into the operating portion of your funds, or whether they're unrestricted and come from the social activities and be able to be used for the social activities. The important element of this is that money that comes from social activities can actually be spent on chapter operations. You can buy music or other what are called operating expenses with social money. You just can't do it the other way. You can't use the operating funds to pay for social activities. So here's kind of the restriction, or the fence, if you want to think of it, Money that comes from the public has to be used for purposes that are related to the mission and operation of the chapter as a 501c3 organization. Money that comes from the members can be used pretty much for virtually anything. Not quite anything, but virtually anything. So that's the element of difficulty, I guess. It's one of the things that is probably one of the hardest things to get your mind around as a new treasurer coming on board, is how do I keep track of these restricted versus unrestricted funds. And the simple answer is that the chart of accounts does it for you. And structuring a report that gives you this detail on a quarterly or yearly basis will show you where you stand to make sure that you're in balance and you're not spending money that came in from the public on social activities. I'll stop there for just a few seconds because I know this can be a difficult topic for people to understand. If there's any questions at this point, why don't we just take them right at this point? Cecilia?
Yes, so is it not possible for money that comes from members to be used to support a member who can't afford to pay dues, for instance? I think.
Yeah, that's a question that often comes up, and the answer is that the IRS regulations are very clear that the funds of the organization cannot be used, regardless of where they come from. The funds of the organization cannot be used for the benefit of a single member. Okay, and more importantly, the purpose, or the trigger, if you will, of the need for that kind of potential support is also a consideration, because the fact that a person lost his job or is otherwise in financial difficulty is not related to the mission or operation of the chapter. And that's the important consideration from an IRS perspective, that money you spend should be either to support the members who are providing operations in such as sing-outs and shows and competitions and even just the fraternal aspect of what we do, or the money that comes from the public is used appropriately in those ways. So unfortunately, the answer is that a chapter cannot decide to pay the dues for one single member. Now, there is a gray area exception to this, and that is essentially the society, or the chapter could, in some circumstances, create classes or subclasses of membership. So let's say you have a competing chorus versus the non-competing members of your chapter. If your chapter wants to support the competing people who are traveling to an international convention, say, that's perfectly legitimate, because now you've identified a class or subclass of the members who would receive a benefit. Or a youth person, if you wanted to, as society allows, a youth person, if you want to, after the first year, to continue to pay their dues, if you do it for every youth member who's a member of your chapter, then that's perfectly legitimate. But you can't make an exception for just one person. Now, if your chapter is so well off that they want to pay the dues for everybody in your chapter, they could do that. Because again, they're not restricting it to any one person. But as soon as you start talking about something that's for the benefit of one person, it's extremely difficult to find an argument that supports that. I know that's not the answer that chapters want to hear, but that unfortunately is the correct answer.
John, can I?
So if the class was a group of people who lost their jobs or who
It's
were below the poverty level, say.
No, again, it's not related to the mission of the chapter. When you have the competing chorus or even youth membership, you're supporting the ability of youth to become involved and enjoy the hobby of barbershop singing. It's related to the purpose and mission of the chapter. Losing your job, even if there are a number of people in your chapter that's happened to, is not related to the mission of the chapter. I'm sorry, Dave, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to offer a possible workaround here, and you're in a little bit of a gray area, but this may help. There's nothing that would restrict a person from paying another person's bill.
Mhm.
So, if I wanted to pay for your membership, that's my business. That's not a chapter activity. That's just, I'm willing to pay that bill for you. Okay, so if you can identify other members in your chapter who are willing to step forward and say, I can support and help somebody else out in a trying time,
It's,
you could make that arrangement, and that's not the chapter paying for it. You've identified,
yeah,
my brother's going to write the check for the utilities this week.
and that's true. That's sometimes chapters do that informally by just having a list of names of people who are willing to do that. Sometimes they create what's called an angel fund, which is not in the chapter's books. It's not in their bank account, but one person may be designated to maintain that fund, and then it's tapped when those kinds of circumstances come about. But the key consideration is that the chapter's funds, any money that comes into the chapter as revenue, cannot be used for the benefit of a single member in that type of a situation. Okay.
So along those lines, I was wondering if there's a way for the angel fund to be designated as not chapter funds. It's money that's raised for the specific among members for the specific purpose of providing loans to somebody who is unable to pay his dues. So is there a way to designate that designate that as not being chapter funds?
Not within the chapter's bank accounts, because the chapter uses cash basis accounting. Money that comes in is revenue, money that goes out is expense when it happens. The only other exception to that, or you can see down at the bottom of this, there's something called pass-through expenses, but this isn't really a pass-through expense. Let me explain that for just a second. A pass-through expense is, for example, when a chapter wants to purchase convention registrations so that everyone sits in a block together. So they will purchase 50 or 100 registrations from international, and then they'll collect the individual money from the members for those registrations. Well, that is an activity that the member himself could do by writing a check or going online and purchasing the registration himself. In that situation, the chapter is only acting as an agent for the member, and it's not revenue for the chapter, and it's not an expense for the chapter. It's essentially a pass-through expenditure because it's something that the member could do for himself, but as a convenience the chapter is doing for him. This is not the same as what we're talking about, a potential angel fund, because an angel fund would be accumulated from a number of people, and then there would have to be a decision-making process about who would use the money, how it would be used, who would benefit from it. So there's a lot of strings attached to it that are not attached to what is traditionally known as a pass-through expenditure. So hopefully that helps you understand what that distinction is.
Nick raised a question about chop with script.
What? Okay.
Which I think he's looking to say, what is that restricted or unrestricted? And I would call that fundraising income to the chapter.
Yes, you're talking about the difference between what the member pays versus what the chapter, the portion of it that the chapter gets as fundraising income. And that, yes, it would be fundraising income. But again, if your chapter is fortunate enough to sell $100,000 worth of script that the chapter gets a 3 or 4% benefit, fundraising benefit from, that $100,000 is not income to your chapter, and $97,000 is not expense to your chapter. It's merely the fundraising element that comes to your chapter as a result of that activity, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
And is that fundraising restricted or not?
Fundraising income is almost always restricted, primarily because and again, this is complicated by the changes in the tax law a few years ago, but back when pretty much anybody could choose to take a charitable deduction on their tax return, if you take a charitable deduction on your tax return, then that the IRS doesn't want to allow people and organizations to doubly avoid taxation. So they want the money to be used in a restricted way because the person who donated the money already got a benefit by donating the money. And whether that happens directly through the chapter, whether it happens through an intermediary like the Society or Harmony Foundation, it doesn't really matter. It's the nature of fundraising that the money is expected to be used for the mission and purposes of the chapter as a nonprofit organization.
So that would go for a donation from a member also.
Yes. Yeah. The only there is one exception in the IRS regulations to that, and it's pretty arcane. If you get a letter from the donor saying that I do not intend to take this as a charitable deduction on my personal tax return, then it could be considered as essentially unrestricted income for these social activities. But again, it's kind of a gray area. I try to keep that as much as possible in the as part of the fundraising pool of money that's coming into the chapter.
Well, John, for scripts, a member puts $10 in and they get $10 out. They're not seeing any part of a donation or anything because there's a percentage. I know we did with that, we have a totally separate account. All the scripts are done in a separate account outside of our normal account. And then it can be used basically unrestricted. It's any...
Well, no, that's not true because you're right. The member is paying $10 and getting a $10 benefit, but the chapter is getting a, what is it, 30 cents or whatever contribution from that, and the contribution is essentially coming from the supermarket chain or Target or Walmart or whoever's issuing that card, ultimately. So it is coming from an entity that is part of the public, not part of your membership. Okay?
Yep.
Okay. Again, this topic is dealt with in pretty great detail in the Treasurer's Manual, so if you do have some additional questions on that, please refer to that. As Dave said, we're always here to answer questions even after the session is over. So let's just talk about some of the activities or the duties of the treasurer throughout the course of a year. The ongoing duties are to keep accurate records and pay bills and invoices, of course. One of your duties is to report the current financial status and comparison to budget at every board meeting, or as often as the board wants to get that information. Some don't want it at every meeting. Preferably you give that information in advance so that they can look at it and have their questions ready for you, so you don't take up a whole lot of time in the board meetings doing that. And let's focus in a little bit on that reporting, because the level of detail that you provide in your reports depends on the audience for the report. And again, we're looking at the purpose and the audience of the report. For your own purposes, and for purposes of the person who's going to be doing your financial review, you want to keep the broadest possible level of detail. And that in Quicken and Quickbooks are what are known as transaction listings. It's the check register, it's the list of deposits, it's a journal entry list. It's essentially every single transaction that occurs and the detail related to that transaction during the course of the year. You need that for your own records as treasurer, and the financial reviewer needs that to be able to dig into the detail and give the comfort to the board that the transactions were recorded appropriately. Moving up to the chapter board and sometimes grant applications, you don't want to give them that level of detail, and it's better for them to get more summarized information. So for example, while your chart of accounts may have 15, 20, 25 different revenue categories and 50 or 60 expense categories, you want to condense that down to the broad headings. Show revenue, membership revenue, grant donations, and 2 or 3 or 5 elements of revenue, 15 or so elements of expenses. And that makes sense to most board members, especially when you compare it to a budget and you explain where the variances in the budget are. So that is much more useful to a person who is, first of all, not financially savvy, and it also prevents people from digging too deeply into the weeds when they look at if they were looking at your transaction listing and starting to ask questions about things that are time wasters. Honestly, when you show someone in the chapter that you're spending $35 a month on your chapter's phone bill, for example, someone will inevitably say, I only spend $25 a month. Why are we spending $35 a month? And you wind up wasting time talking about something that's inconsequential to the board of the chapter. So it's important to recognize the difference between keeping records at a transaction level but reporting at a higher level, condensed level, that makes sense to the audience of the report. Now that doesn't say that you can't provide extra information, what I call a project income and expense summary. And the classic example of this is, how did your annual show do? You have a subset of your chart of accounts that deals with the revenue and expenses for your show, and sometimes you start selling tickets in November or December for a show that's going to happen in February or March, and it straddles your calendar year. And cash basis accounting doesn't let you defer or set up prepaid expenses. But what you can do is you can create a report that isolates those expenses and only covers the October through March timeframe and shows exactly how the chapter did on a show, whether they made money from the show or not. So that's an extra report that you can provide over and above the normal income statement and cash position that you'd be giving on a regular basis. And finally, when the highest level is essentially what I call a highly summarized report, and that's sometimes useful for a grant application, especially for the small organizations that we are. They really only need to see where the money comes from, whether it's dues from the public, donations, and the kinds of things that we're spending money on, chapter operations versus social activities versus whatever else. But again, very summarized, 3 or 4 lines of revenue, 10 lines of income of expenses at the most, and just a statement of what your cash balance is, because in cash basis accounting, the only thing that sits on your balance sheet is your cash position, offset by members' equity. So that is essentially the difference of the level of reporting, depending on the purpose of the report and the audience of the report. So, moving through the rest of the treasurer's duties throughout the year. In January, you complete the prior year's accounting, provide a preliminary report to the board, present a budget if you haven't done it already before the end of the year, which is always a good thing to shoot for. And we'll talk about budgeting a little later. Prepare and send receipts for charitable donations that are given directly to your chapter. This is not for anything that comes in from BHS or Harmony Foundation, but someone who makes a donation greater than $250 directly to your chapter needs to be given a receipt for purposes of potentially using it on their personal tax return. And finally, you need to file the 1099s and the 1096 summary with the IRS for any payments that are greater than $600, and we'll deal with that after I get through the calendar. We'll have some detail on that. In February, you're presenting the annual financial statements to the board, and you're hopefully ready to give the prior year information, all that detail, to whoever's going to be doing the financial review for the chapter. In March, you're working with the secretary to ensure that the incorporation status remains active. May's a big month. You file whatever Form 990 is required with the IRS. You review the financial review report with the president and get ready to upload that to the society, and also upload the 990 acknowledgement to the BHS website. The intervening months are basically just the regular months where you report the actual versus budget information to the chapter board. But in November, if you've been lucky enough to find your replacement, you assist that person with the transition to the position and encourage them to attend this session, because especially if they're new to it and don't have an accounting or bookkeeping background, they're going to need as much help getting started as possible. In December, you should be, the secretary should be preparing the annual Ascap filing and there's a payment if necessary. Now, this year's a little different because for 2020, many chapters didn't have any annual shows. And if you didn't have any shows, then there's no need for an Ascap filing. That's clearly covered in the Secretary's manual, but the question often comes up from the Treasurer's perspective as well. And in December, you recommend, hopefully, a person who will be able to do the financial review of the chapter, recommend that for the President to appoint that person. And a couple of things that need to be done prior to year end. So we'll cover the 1099 information in a little more detail in a few minutes. Your role as a financial advisor is different than your role as a bookkeeper, obviously. You participate in the short-term and long-term planning of the chapter, and that's part of the budgeting process where you need to be able to say not just where are we going in the next 6 months, 12 months, but what are the long-term goals of the chapter? How often do we want to replace uniforms? How often do we compete, and how does that affect our budgeting in terms of potential expenses for coaching or new music or whatever is involved in that? So you're an advisor in terms of what the costs of that those long-term plans could be. Similarly, you advise on major projects and contracts and events. I mean, hopefully your chapter has a contract. If you're paying your music chorus director, hopefully you have a contract with him, and that contract should cover some very specific things, and you as the treasurer help the president understand what should be in that contract. A big part of the treasurer's responsibility is to act as essentially a devil's advocate at board meetings. It's not a sometimes pleasant process, but sometimes you need to rein in the enthusiasm of the board members and just say, can we really do this? And it's not that you're questioning it, but it's just that you're making sure they understand the potential difficulty of going down a certain road that they may not understand all the financial implications of. And finally, as a financial advisor, your role is essentially assisting the president in prioritizing the budget requests from the various people in the chapter, because invariably there's more requests to spend money than there is money coming in. And that's a process that needs to be done every year. You also potentially work with the secretary to maintain the incorporation status if there's a payment required, and this is varies by state. Some states require a periodic payment, others only want an updated list of officers and directors, and others only want you to contact them when there's a change in a registered agent. Mid-Atlantic District has 8 states and the District of Columbia. We don't have the details on all of those, so that's something that your secretary should be aware of and on top of in terms of whatever's required to maintain the incorporation status. So let's spend a few minutes talking about IRS issues now. One of the important things that you need to do on an annual basis is to file Forms 1099 related to payments to people who provide services to your chapter that are in excess of $600 on an annual basis. And that could be your chorus director, it could be quartets, coaches you bring in, anyone who essentially is paid more than $600 for those services. There is a new wrinkle this year. Those payments used to be reported on the 1099 miscellaneous form, and now the IRS has come up with a new form for non-employee compensation, which is essentially what this is. These independent contractors are not employees, but their income must be reported to the IRS. There is guidance. Hopefully you have received, or you will receive momentarily, an email from the Society that goes into a little bit of detail on the preparation of the 1099 NEC and how you can do that this year. But I'm going to go through some of that. Before I do that, I do want to talk just a little bit about the difference between an independent contractor and an employee. Almost no chapters have an employer-employee relationship with anyone on their staff, if you want to think of it that way. It's very unusual to do that, and the primary reason is that there are benefits to the chapter and also to the person to be treated as an independent contractor versus as an employee. But you have to meet some very specific criteria, and I'm going to focus on two of these. And you'll see that the first one is this, the independent contractor works independently of the control of the owner and has authority to decide how to accomplish tasks without the employer's input. If you think of a chorus director, the chorus director doesn't ask the chapter president or board what they want him to teach, what music, he may have input from a music committee in terms of what music they're going to buy and learn, but how he teaches, what he does on a week-to-week basis is pretty much under the control of the chorus director. So this is a very important consideration for determining that a person is an independent contractor versus an employee. And also, the person is paid and compensated under the terms of a contract between the employer and the independent contractor. This is really important. You do need to have a contract because the person is not just being compensated for the time that he or she is spending in front of the chapter. I was a college instructor many years ago, and there's a general rule of thumb in the education community that for every hour you spend in front of a class, it takes 3 hours of preparation for that. And when you think about a chorus director, they're pretty much doing the same thing. They're preparing at home on their own time, in their own way. They're preparing for that 2 or 3 hours that they're going to be spending on a Tuesday night in front of the chorus. So that's essentially what you're compensating them for, not just the time they're standing in front of the chorus, but for the total job they are doing, no matter when, where, or how they're doing it. And that's the important thing that needs to be documented in a contract, that they have that ability to do that on their own. If you don't have that, it's very easy for the IRS, and not even so much the IRS, for a state to come in and say, no, this person's really an employee, because they're only looking at it from the perspective of showing up on Tuesday nights. So that's pretty much the difference on why you want to have an independent contractor relationship. The benefit to the contractor is that they are essentially a business. They report their income on their personal tax return. They can file a Schedule C as a business, and they get to deduct expenses related to that business that an employee would usually not be able to deduct on their personal tax return. So there's benefits on both sides of the issue. One of the benefits to the chapter is that you're not paying employment taxes for the person. You're not paying Social Security and Medicare taxes. You're not paying workers' compensation or unemployment insurance related to that. So there's a significant potential savings there as well. So yes, there is a difference between independent contractors and employees, and it's almost always better to be treated as an independent contractor under these circumstances. So the actual process itself, before you or as you contract with a person, whether it's your chorus director, whether it's a quartet, you need to get their identifying number, whether it's a social security number or whether it's a taxpayer identification number. You ask the person that you'll be paying to give you this information. You don't give it to the IRS, you just keep it on file, but you need to have some documentation from them that this is how they can be identified to the IRS. If you don't do this and they give you an inaccurate number, or you don't get a social security number from that person, your chapter could be on the hook for income and social security and Medicare taxes on whatever income is paid to that person. So it's very important to get this document, and this is available on the IRS website. Get that from the person before you make any payments to them. I mentioned that the 1099 miscellaneous is the form that used to be used for providing information to the IRS about this, but this is the old form. This was what you used up through 2019. Do not use this form any longer, even for 2020. There is a new requirement, a new form. It's called 1099 NEC for non-employee compensation. That came into effect for 2020, and that is the form that needs to be filed for chorus directors, quartets, anyone who provides services to your chapter.
John, quick question.
Sure.
How do I obtain one of those forms? I read that they have to be mailed to you by the IRS. Is that correct? Bruce, you might have said something different in the chat.
Well, if you're still wanting to file a paper return with the IRS, yes, this is one of the few forms that the IRS does not allow you to download a PDF and print. They pre-print, or they have approved certain vendors to pre-print these forms in red, as you can see, because they're using optical character recognition software that probably dates back to the 1960s. And that's the requirement, that these forms must be printed in a very specific way so that information can be read by their computer system. Now, you don't have to file on paper. There are services available online that can file a single 1099 for somewhere between $1.50 and $4 for a single 1099. That's not outrageous. Actually, if you use Quickbooks, you can file a 1099 from inside Quickbooks, and it doesn't cost you anything.
So I don't use QuickBooks, I use Quicken. Someone mentioned efileforbiz.com. Is that a good service to use?
That's one of the services. Actually, there are four websites that will be in the information that you get from the society. eFile for Business is one. Tax1099.com, I think, is the one that has a relationship with QuickBooks, and there are two others. But they're all pretty much in the same ballpark. Just make sure that when you do a Google search or you find the information, the best thing to do is to make sure that when you get, if you do a Google search for electronic filing of 1099, just make sure that you get the website link itself. The first 3 or 4 links will probably be ads that may take you to those websites, but they may also be spoofed ads that are trying to harvest your identification information.
Okay,
so,
thanks very much.
But that's pretty much, yes, this can be done online, and it's probably better to do it online. But if you are going to use the paper method, you also have to file a 1096 form, which is a summary of all of the 1099s. Even if you only file one, you still have to put a 1096 on it, and this is the box to check for the 1099 NECs. Now, if you file it online electronically, you don't you don't have to worry about this. The service takes care of this. You just provide the information for the 1099 NEC form, click submit, and everything else. You can even have the service mail it to the recipient for an additional charge, or you can print it from the PDF that they send you to give to him, not to send to the IRS, him or her. So the ability to do this online is a very, I look at it as a time-saving process rather than trying to chase down paper copies of 1099s, which you can't really get single copies of them. You either have to buy packs of 25 or 50 of them from Staples, or you have to go to a local CPA firm or tax preparer and beg them to give you a couple of them. That's the way it was done in the old days, but with the e-filing issues, it's a lot easier to do that now.
You can beg me for that as well. I've got some extras.
John, a question that has come up in other places, if you have a second.
Sure.
I've been asked a couple of times, and I don't know the answer to this, if there's going to be a difference in the way that insurance is collected, or is there any change in the financial obligation from a chapter in terms of insurance because of like COVID and not meeting and all that sort of thing? Or, and an extension of that question, kind of a, another color of it is there anything special that has to be done because of COVID when we start to get back together?
As far as I know, there has been no change one way or the other in terms of the coverage or the payment for insurance. That information usually comes out from Harmony Hall around this time, January, February of the year. And I'm not aware of any specific changes that would be related one way or the other.
Okay.
I don't anticipate that there would be any significant changes. I think at worst there might be some waivers that they would want you to sign if you're going to have a show with an audience that's not socially distanced or something along those lines.
Right.
But I think it's too early.
Right.
That's probably the discussions that are happening right now at Harmony Hall with the insurance company.
One of the motivators is that a lot of your smaller chapters, struggling to, have loss of income issues and whatnot. It's like, the insurance costs a bit. It's like, why am I paying insurance? So anyway, the question comes up. So, when you get to that slide or you get to talk about that, Secretary's class, it came up, and I know I've been approached by others. If you could just sort of touch on that, I think that would be good.
Yes. Bruce, I think you raised the question, or you made the comment, that treating a course director as an independent contractor and not as an employee means that your chapter can't apply for a payroll protection plan loan, forgivable loan from the CARES Act or the follow-up to the CARES Act that just came out. While that's true, I think the benefits of being an independent contractor in the long run outweigh any short-term benefit you might get as a forgivable loan for it, because don't forget, between the Social Security, Medicare, unemployment, and workers' comp types of taxes, you're paying 10% of whatever income you're paying to that person as payroll taxes from your organization. And that is continuous over time. So yes, you might get a short-term benefit from treating them as an employee, but now you've set a precedent with the IRS that they are employees, and in the long run, that's not really the beneficial situation.
Yeah, that's pretty much the way I see it too. I just wanted to explore all the angles, but that's very much the way that we see it too.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so let's just quickly cover the issue of 990s, there are three broad flavors of 990s. There's the main 990, which is for when your chapter has gross receipts over $200,000. The 990 EZ, which is not particularly easy, when gross receipts are between $50,000 and $200,000. And then there's the 990N for gross receipts under $50,000. I'll talk about what gross receipts are in a minute, but just by a show of hands, is anybody here over $50,000? I know, Dave, you are, but beyond, beyond that. Simon and Dave. Okay. Well, the 990 EZ even, let's just back up. Gross receipts for definitional purposes of the IRS are essentially income to the chapter. So it's membership dues, show tickets, donations, all of those kinds of things. One of the exceptions to gross receipts is the pass-through type of income and expenditures that I spoke about earlier. That is not counted toward gross receipts. The other important consideration in gross receipts is that these numbers, when you read the IRS regulations, it's gross receipts that are ordinarily under $50,000. So if you pop over $50,000 for an unusual circumstance one year, that doesn't automatically require you to file a 990 EZ. If you pop up and pop back under 50,000, you can continually file the 990N for your chapter. You'll see that when I show the image of the 990N. 990s are information returns. The IRS grants us tax exemption through the Barbershop Harmony Society, and we have obligations because of that tax exemption. Their chapters are nonprofits, and they're nonprofits by virtue of the BHS umbrella exemption for all of its chapters and districts and subsidiaries. And your chapter must still file necessary paperwork to maintain its status as a nonprofit organization, even though you exist as a nonprofit under the umbrella exemption. So it's an obligation of your chapter, not the society as a whole. Failure to file could result in the loss of your chapter's tax-exempt status, and the process of reapplying to get that tax-exempt status back is particularly difficult. It's essentially applying all over again to become a nonprofit organization with a lot of paperwork and detail, and I think it's about a $400 fee to do that. So it's something that's easy to avoid, and just don't let yourself fall into that type of situation. Losing your tax-exempt status could result in the chapter's charter being suspended, and that would affect your chapter's ability, say, to compete in contests. So the 990 form itself, when you're over $200,000 in revenue, it's at least 25 pages long, and unless you are extremely capable and fluent in tax preparation, you probably need professional help to prepare that. I don't think anyone here is anybody here over $200,000?
No.
No. Okay.
Wish.
We wish is right. The 990 EZ, as I said, it's between 50,000 and 200,000. It normally runs about 12 pages. It can be prepared by yourself. It's better to have someone knowledgeable help you with it at least. There are online services that are available to do this. So if you have the situation where you're filing a 990EZ or need to file a 990EZ and have never done it before, please reach out to Dave Welter or to me or to Steve Stoyovsky, and we can give you some guidance in that and point you in the right direction. The 990N is where most of us live. And as you can see, it says gross receipts are normally 50,000 or less. That's that's what I was talking about, that normally. If you happen to pop over, it doesn't really matter for 1 or 2 years. As you can see, this is the entire form. There's no other information required. This is it. 5 or 6 items of information: the name of the organization, whether you're on a calendar year or not, the contact person, usually the treasurer, your website, and put a check mark here. This is available online. It's actually available now for 2020. I just filled out my chapters yesterday for 2020. It takes about 5 minutes at most, and you receive an acknowledgement back from the IRS probably within about 15 or 20 minutes of filing this. So it's very easy to do, and there's no reason that you should ever be in violation of not filing this particular form when your revenue is under $50,000. So moving on with the IRS issues, sometimes members ask you, what expenses can I deduct on my personal tax return related to Barbershop? Well, it's complicated. And there's actually a whole page or page and a half of information in the Treasurer's Manual about this. It's a little out of date now because it, again, is meant to be cover the circumstances where people could ordinarily file their personal taxes with charitable deductions and other itemized deductions. That changed drastically with the tax reform that was passed in 2017, and a lot of people who used to itemize their deductions no longer do that. So it's a little different, but there are certain circumstances where it may make sense, and there are things that are related to that. So I don't want to get into any of the details of this at the moment, but there are some things that you should be aware of just in general terms. When you're looking at mileage rates, one of the things that's sometimes difficult for people to understand is that they get reimbursed from their businesses at 57.5 cents a mile, or they can claim a business deduction at 57.5 cents a mile if they file a Schedule C for an unincorporated business. But charitable mileage allowance is only 14 cents a mile, and that's been locked at that level for decades. It takes an act of Congress to change that, and that's not likely to happen. So that is something, again, that is usually a source of question from a charitable member. Why can't I use the 57.5 cent amount? And this would only apply even in a charitable circumstance. This doesn't apply for normal rehearsals. This would apply for things like going to conventions or going to sing-outs if there's a travel component to going to a sing-out or a performance. The person who's traveling to be part of that performing chorus can take deductions for that if they're filing itemized deductions on their tax return. But it's complicated, and there is guidance, as I said, in the Treasurer's Manual about this. And like anything, the standard wording for anything related to the tax, talk to their tax advisor before taking deductions, because your situation may be different, as everybody's could be. As far as state issues are concerned, there generally are no annual information returns like the 990s required, especially when you're filing a 990N. There generally is no requirement to file a 990 or equivalent type of form with the state. However, it could happen if, for example, your chapter is registered to solicit contributions in your state, then you may have a reporting requirement. And that solicitation registration can be triggered by something as simple as having a Donate Now button on your website. That means you're actively soliciting donations from the public, according to the state. And if you put that on your website and you don't register for a solicitation permit, you will be contacted in relatively short order by the Secretary of State's office, at least in Maryland. That happened to my chapter. And you will be given instructions on how to apply for that registration, which usually involves a pretty significant payment and registration process, or you will be instructed to take the Donate Now button off your website. So that's something that you may or may not be interested in, but it does have repercussions. Some states also allow nonprofit organizations to have a sales tax exemption, and that sometimes may need to be renewed on an annual or periodic basis. Some states make this a relatively easy process. I think Pennsylvania's process is relatively painless. Other states are particularly difficult about trying to get this sales tax exemption. And the important thing is to remember, what is it that your chapter actually buys that attracts sales tax? Is it really worth the time and effort to save 50 or 100, maybe even at most $100 over the course of a year when you have to pay something for the permit and you have to remember to renew it every year, and then you have to provide the permit every time you buy something at Staples or other types of goods that might attract the sales tax. So it's something to consider, but generally speaking, I find that it's not worth the aggravation and the time and effort that it takes to maintain that. So this would have been the point that we had a break. I think we've pretty much answered at least most of the questions that I saw up to the point that we did take a break. Dave, are we looking at any additional questions related to things that we've done so far?
I've answered a few. If those aren't complete to anyone's acceptance, come up now and we'll discuss further.
Okay, so any other questions about anything that we talked about in the previous hour?
Do you have any good suggestions on free filing services for the 990? Like last year, I think I found a place called efile.org or 990file.org.
Right.
Are you guys familiar with them? Are they sketchy? Or are they good service?
Oh, that's fine. They work really well, and
Okay.
if you're dealing with small numbers, that probably wouldn't trigger it.
Yeah, I just wanted something that was free, and I didn't want to spend money on a CPA.
I won't go ahead, Bruce.
Quick question. How is insurance billed? Do we get a letter from the society or an email, or we have to?
Yes, you get a letter and a flyer about the insurance coverage. There's two types of insurance coverage. That is mandatory and optional coverage from the society. You get information from that usually around this time of the year, January or February. I am not sure about the billing process, if it's one payment or if it's broken out on a monthly basis. Dave, do you have how that works? Have you seen that?
For insurance?
For insurance from the society?
It's typically annual.
It's annual, okay. So that will be, and again, that information, it comes from the society. in where they tell you what the charge, which is based on the membership of the chapter at a certain point in time, I believe, and then they tell you what the mandatory coverage is going to cost, and then provide you with the opportunity to sign up with any of the optional coverage on things like your risers and sound equipment and things like that. So that is something that comes directly from the society, and hopefully the material they send you will answer your questions on that.
Hopefully they will also address the COVID liability and how that's going to be handled.
Yes, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not aware of, I imagine those discussions are happening right now between the society and the insurance company, but I'm not aware of any changes in the policy or the coverage or the costs that might be related to the COVID pandemic, but that I'm sure will be addressed in whatever communication comes out from the society.
I just had an observation. If our chapters are intent on holding a holiday show, and it's going to be in a local school hall, in their auditorium, the school usually asks for insurance coverage, and this is a wonderful avenue. If you have the one from VHS, you just have to add the school onto that umbrella, and you're covered.
Yeah, there's a very easy process to request an insurance certificate from the society. You can either do it on the website or you can call up customer service and they'll walk you through it, and then you'll get an email with a PDF of the insurance certificate that you can provide to the school district or to whoever the promoter of the show is. Okay, so let's keep moving on here. We covered pretty much everything that I said we would cover. We will cover this going forward, and we'll talk now about the financial review. A financial review, the important aspect of this is that it provides comfort to the chapter board and the president that the treasurer is handling the finances of the chapter in an appropriate way, and it's not designed to look for fraud or to uncover abnormalities, but it's really just to make sure that the information that should be there is there, and it can be easily understood not only by the treasurer but by anyone who might come in after the fact to look at it, and even in the very off chance that the IRS or a state agency wants to come in and say, show us your financial records for the past 3 years. You need to have that available and be able to give it to them. As I said, it's very rare that would happen, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. I'm aware in my time as a treasurer instructor over the past 22 years, I'm aware of 3 chapters in 1 district that had such a request from the IRS or a state agency to actually come in and do an audit of their finances. So it does happen, but it's pretty much a rare occurrence. The important thing to understand about a financial review is that it's not an audit. In the accepted use of that term as a defined term in the accounting and auditing profession. If you think of an audit, it's what a CPA does for a small, medium, or large business to give comfort to the shareholders of the business and any other users of the financial information of an organization. We are so small that our chapters are so small that an audit would probably cost 25% of our annual budget, if not more, if we engaged a CPA to do that. Just of the risk factor to the CPA of doing an audit in general for any organization. So it's not something that is a defined term. It's often used inaccurately to describe the financial review process, but it really is much simpler than that. What a financial review should cover are things like, are bank reconciliations done on a timely basis, and are they accurate? Are payments made on a timely basis, and there's supporting documentation for the payments? Is there adherence to contracts and budgets? Are the files organized properly, and are you keeping backups for things that you do? This is pretty simple stuff that even a person who's not an accountant or a bookkeeper or a CPA can do for your chapter. It doesn't require a lot of expertise, financial expertise, to do this. It's addressed, the report is ultimately addressed to the chapter board, because they're the ones that are expected to get the comfort from having this review performed. And the report itself would be uploaded to the BHS website along with the 990 confirmation and the incorporation status on an annual basis. So it's an important process. The financial review, there is an, on the Document Center of the Society's website, there are 2 or 3 documents about how to perform a financial review and what the report itself should look like. So whoever is doing that for your chapter, you can download that information and give it to them, and then work with them to have that done on a timely basis. Okay, budgeting. Budgeting is really important, and why it's important is that it essentially creates ownership by the functional areas of your chapter. The people who provide information for the budget are then held accountable for that. It's the way things should work. The treasurer is not the person who has the responsibility of preparing the budget. The treasurer compiles a budget from information that is given to him or her by the people who are in charge of the functional areas, the music VP, the chorus director, the membership VP, people who have responsibility for determining the number of pieces of music they're going to buy, the number of times they're going to bring a coach in, whether they're going to compete or not. All these pieces of information are necessary to create a budget, but they're not pieces of information that a treasurer is expected to be able to prepare or have come up with on his own, his or her own, for those functional areas. So it really is important to get the buy-in, and this is where the president can help you in enforcing the buy-in of the preparation and of requests for budget expenditures from these functional areas. And then the role of the treasurer is to compile that into a presentation for the president and the treasurer to then essentially prioritize the requests, because there's almost always more requests to spend money than there is available money coming in to the chapter. So you have to prioritize the expenditures, and then you present a budget request to the board and hopefully have it approved not too long after the beginning of your calendar year. And then the ongoing role of the treasurer is the actual versus budget reporting on whatever time frame that the president and the board expect to see that level of reporting. Some of the things you should take into consideration when you're compiling the budget is what are things in your chapter that affect the budget. You know, the connection to the community, your ability to do multiple shows over the course of the year, the demographics of your chapter, the age stratification of your chapter determines the level of dues that are paid by certain members. The chapter mission, is it your mission to compete, or is it your mission to be a social organization? Whether you have internal coaching available in the chapter, or that's a resource that you might have to pay for outside. External conditions to consider. You know, obviously this year the big external condition is the pandemic, but that's temporary, hopefully. And it sounds it's gone on a lot longer than we thought it would. But the thing is that we should be planning now for how we're going to resume in-person rehearsals, how we're going to resume our annual show, and other aspects of our role as a performing arts organization. And we need to be taking a good hard look at that and preparing for it, so that when we do have not necessarily the all clear, but we do have a significant portion of the membership and our communities vaccinated, that we can safely start reapproaching these activities that are such an important part of what we do. So that is pretty much the how and the why. You shouldn't consider, once you pass a budget by the chapter board, you shouldn't necessarily modify it for any purpose or any circumstance that comes along. But if there are developments such as a pandemic, or if your chapter show only brings in half of the revenue that you thought it would, those are pretty major developments, and you probably need to modify your budget. But just because you had a contractual increase in the cost of your rehearsal facility, or you're paying your director a little more, that's not really a reason to go through the process of modifying the entire budget in the middle of the year. So, any questions on the financial review or the budgeting before we move on to software?
Quick comment, if I may.
Sure.
The threshold between what's an emergency situation bad enough to require a budget modification and what's not is how close are you to bankruptcy?
It's always a consideration. But yes, you know, as I said, if you have a major situation like a shortfall in show revenue or the inability to perform because of a pandemic, obviously that's going to require a modification. The society went through that. You know, we had a budget, we had a 2020 budget that was approved in July of 2019. And in March of 2020, we basically tore that budget up and created a whole new, what we called a pivot budget, to work through the rest of 2020 and to sketch out what could happen in 2021 and 2022 based on certain scenarios of having conventions, not having conventions, membership declines, all of these kinds of things. So yeah, when you have those kinds of situations, you need to retrench and understand where your resources are and how you're going to get through whatever period of time you need to get through. But as I said, for relatively minor speed bumps, it's not necessary to work to those kinds of adjustments. Okay, so software, always an interesting topic. I see from the responses that I got to my email that we have a mix of people who are using Quicken, We have QuickBooks. We have a couple of people who are using Excel. And it's all good in its own way, but let's just look at it from a basic point of view. Why would you use any software, any bookkeeping software? The primary benefit is to have proper and consistent classification of income and expenses. Using software doesn't make the input side of recording transactions any easier. If anything, it makes it a little more difficult, but you have to be more careful about where you categorize things and how you record them and do it on a timely basis. Where it helps is the other end, getting a report out on that information, because once the information is entered appropriately, now you can customize a report to track budgets, do year-over-year comparisons, do those type of annual show reports that span 2 fiscal years, and then have a complete backup of all that information and have it available for the financial review and for future use. So it's an important concept, and it's something that we should all be doing, and we are, I believe. Not everyone answered my email, but the ones who did are using this. So the primary recommendation that we've been making for the past 15 or 20 years, maybe longer, is to use Quicken for chapter finances. Quicken is personal finance software, but it's extensible enough for most basic chapter functions, and it serves the purpose. And people who use it generally agree that it's not perfect, but it's cheap, and it generally has served the purpose. So the question becomes, should I stop using QuickBooks, or should I upgrade? Should I Quicken, or should I upgrade to QuickBooks, or even use something else? It's not always an easy choice, but one of the things to consider, and I'll go through the pros and cons here in a minute, one of the things to consider is actually the cost on an ongoing basis, and I'll get to that in a minute. But just the pluses and minuses. Quicken is simple to learn. It's very, very similar to using a personal checkbook, and it has pretty useful but relatively limited reports on it. The minuses are now, from a cost basis, they have moved to an annual subscription model only. So you can no longer purchase a standalone desktop version of Quicken. If you happen to have a standalone version that you bought in 2017, 16, 15, it most likely will still work for the relatively foreseeable future, but it won't let you do things like download bank balances, bank transaction information after a certain period of time. Some of the other minuses, it's designed for personal finances, but it does work for simple businesses like our chapters. It's single entry bookkeeping, and that is, I'm not going to delve into the difference between single entry and double entry bookkeeping and all of that, but it's not the best way to handle the books of any organization. It is cash basis, but sometimes you do need to make accruals, even on a cash basis accounting for very unusual types of circumstances, and you can do it through registers and things like that in Quicken, but it's a little difficult. The main downfall of Quicken is that it has no audit trail. That means that you can record a transaction today and then go into Quicken 3, 4, 6 months, a year from now, and modify that transaction, and there's no record of what the original transaction was, and there's no record of when the change was made or how it was made. So that is a serious limitation that would disqualify any professional level accounting software. But again, we're such small organizations, and we take things, we're such trusting individuals and organizations that we don't consider that a major downfall. QuickBooks, on the other hand, has both a desktop or a subscription model. And I'll get to the cost of those in a few minutes. QuickBooks is true double entry bookkeeping, so every time you have a debit, you need a credit. There is a ability to do cash accrual or modified accrual accounting. Most chapters are on the cash basis, but sometimes it is necessary to do accrual or even modified accrual, or even just do it for internal purposes. For example, you may want to keep track of the cost of your risers or uniforms on a separate schedule, but not necessarily included in your cash basis financial statements. And you can do that in QuickBooks. QuickBooks has a full audit trail because it's designed for business. It's designed for organizations that have audits by CPAs. So every time there's a change made, there's a record kept of who made the change, when it was made, what the change was from and to, and it's very clearly spelled out in the trail of transactions. QuickBooks can also help you prepare 1099s for the organization. There's no additional cost for doing that. And there's a variety of cloud backups available for that. The downside, yeah, there's a bit of a learning curve, but it's not as steep as a lot of people are fearful of. The important thing is that there are templates and sample files for both Quicken and QuickBooks on the BHS website. So you can download a trial version of QuickBooks from the Intuit website for a 30-day free trial. You can download the templates and the sample file, play around with it for a while, and see if you understand it and can work with it before you make any kind of commitment to it. So it's probably something that we should look into. As I mentioned, Quicken now costs $40 to $45 every year. There's no way around this unless you bought a desktop version in 2017 or prior. Once you go past the annual subscription model, if you don't renew it, then there's some element of unusability to the program. What that specifically is, I don't have all the details of, but it is a significant risk that you would not have access to your data if you did not renew the subscription on an annual basis. The thing with Quicken is that there are many levels of Quicken. There's the starter version, the deluxe version, the home and business version, the rental business version, or whatever. You need at least the deluxe version. The starter version will not work well for our chapters. And the benefit of using the subscription model is that you get bug fixes and feature upgrades, and you never lose the ability to download transactions from your banks if that's important to you. QuickBooks is usually, QuickBooks Premier is usually about a $650 investment. And that's well beyond the means of almost any chapter that I'm aware of. However, the desktop version is available from a website called TechSoup.org. That's available only for nonprofit organizations, and you can get this for a $60 one-time fee instead of $650. And the software, like the old desktop versions of Quicken, it's usually good for 3 years in terms of maintaining downloadability from your banks, getting feature upgrades, well, maybe not feature upgrades, but certainly bug fixes for 3 years. So you're looking at possibly spending $60 once every 3 years versus spending $40 or $45 every year for a better product. So that is, QuickBooks can now be less expensive than Quicken. So I mentioned in passing the website that you can get this discounted version of QuickBooks from. And yes, it is a real website, TechSoup.org, and this is their page to order QuickBooks Desktop Premier, including the nonprofit edition for PCs for administration fee of $60, and that gets you a fully functional one single user version of the desktop software. There is a Mac OS version that's also available. It has a few less features than the PC version, but generally speaking, it's roughly equivalent. And if you're using a Mac, it would be, it's actually much more equivalent to the PC version than the Quicken versions for Mac, which are virtually useless in my experience. I use a Mac and a PC myself, and I found that the Quicken for Mac versions are woefully deficient compared to the PC versions. So again, this is, you do have to register your chapter. It takes about 3 or 4 days for that to be approved. But once you're approved as a nonprofit, then you can go in and you can order a number of different categories of software, not just QuickBooks. There are Microsoft products, there are Adobe products. The only consideration is that they need to be used for your chapter. That's the sole purpose that this website exists, to provide low-cost software for nonprofit organizations. So QuickBooks, just to wrap up on this, how hard really is it to learn? Well, it's not really that hard to learn. The home screens do look different. Quicken has this very simplified where do we stand type of thing, while QuickBooks has this what seems to be complicated flow chart. But when you think about it, it's really this the important part of it is right over here in this lower right hand part. And record deposits, reconcile, check register, write checks. This is all the stuff you need to do. All this stuff is pretty much things like invoicing, inventory, and other elements of a business that our chapters just don't need and would never encounter. So it really is not that difficult to use once you get past the different look of it. Both Quicken and QuickBooks use the metaphor of the handwritten check register that all of us, well, maybe not all of us, there are quite a few youngsters on this call. But for those of us who remember the days when we wrote a check and then filled out the information from the check in here, well, that's exactly what you do in Quicken. It looks almost exactly the same, and it really is exactly what you do in QuickBooks as well. So it's very similar. The metaphor is exactly the same. The chart of accounts, the standard chapter chart of accounts from the society, this is what it looks like in Quicken. Oops. And that's what it looks like in QuickBooks. They're the same accounts. You have the choice of using numbers or not using numbers in both of the chart of accounts. You can use your own chart of accounts. You don't have to use the standard BHS recommended chart of accounts. So this exists in the templates that are provided on the Society website. In terms of the reports that come out of the programs, the simplified reports, actual versus budget from Quicken, actual versus budget, and actual versus budget versus prior year in QuickBooks. Very similar, very similar to Modify in terms of, you can see sort of. Not quite sure the detail that you can see on this, but you can select the categories, you can select the time frame, and do all the report modification that you can do in Quicken, which I didn't get that part of the screen above this, but you would have all those available to modify the report on the fly, basically. And there's plenty of help available. The Quicken for Dummies and QuickBooks for Dummies, the whole Dummies series of books for anything are a tremendous resource for people who are new to a software or even just want a quick refresher or something they don't understand about the software. So there are many opportunities to have support from this, as well as QuickBooks gets you a level of support directly from Intuit that is essentially difficult to get for the Quicken product, but you have that available from a customer service process through QuickBooks. So it's something to consider, and we're not making a firm recommendation that people switch, but we want to give you the information that it may not be as inexpensive to keep using Quicken as you think it might have been, and there are options available.
So, John?
Yes?
I'm trying to read between the lines a little bit on what you've been saying. It sounds to me that you're saying QuickBooks is pretty much the same price at Quicken if you get the TechSoup deal. QuickBooks has an audit trail, which Quicken doesn't, which makes it plenty superior. And it pretty much has more functionality than Quicken. And also, it's pretty easy to learn. So are you saying you're recommending people have QuickBooks? It sure sounds like that to me.
I'm actually working with the society right now on whether we are actually going to make a formal recommendation to use QuickBooks, because if we do, we want to do it as an overall process. We want to, the chart of accounts has not been modified since it was developed for manual bookkeeping purposes back in the 70s and 80s, maybe even before then. So we want to take a look at the chart of accounts. We want to make sure that if people are going to switch to QuickBooks and their chapter does have the potential to grow beyond a basic 990N into a 990EZ, how does their chart of accounts map to the financial information that's required on a 990EZ or even a full 990? The current chart of accounts doesn't do that at all. So we want to look at it as a comprehensive process. You can make the change right now. You can use the basic chart of accounts as it exists. It will function for your chapter that's under $50,000 in revenue a year. But if your chapter does grow beyond that 50,000, you'll have to do some conversion process to get the information needed to put on a 990.
So can I add, my chapter, we file in 990EZ pretty much consistently, but we use Quicken. So should we really be thinking about QuickBooks migration?
I think you should, and I think you probably should talk to somebody like Dave from Alexandria, or maybe even somebody from Parkside who are and have been using QuickBooks for quite a while and have the ability to either directly map their chart of accounts to the 990, or they have developed a spreadsheet process to do that for them. It's not an onerous process to do, but like I said, we're not making a formal recommendation until we look at the whole picture in terms of how does this affect the chart of accounts, the reporting process, and even the types of information that the chapters are providing to the society. Because there's a level of, when you think about it, there's a level of activity at the chapters and the districts that involve the public that the society really should know about. Show attendance, convention attendance, fundraising activities, all of this kind of thing. All of these things support the mission not only of your chapter and district, but of the society itself. And we should be reporting as a society on the whole aspect of what we districts, chapters, singing communities, and the society are doing, not just what the $6 million a year operation at Harmony Hall is doing. Because when you factor everything that all of our chapters are doing, we are tens, if not $100 million organization across the entire world. And that's much more beneficial to talk to potential fundraising organizations to support you rather than talking to about a $6 million a year operation.
In an ideal world, John, you would love to be sitting at your computer and have the ability to, at the press of a button, quickly aggregate every chapter's Quickbooks data to deliver exactly the information you wanted to say, give the entire picture of the society. Is that?
In a perfect world, I would love to do that. There are certainly hurdles to doing that. There are privacy considerations. There are all sorts of things that that come into play. But I think there are tremendous benefits to being able to do that, and that is part of the long-term goal of the financial aspect of our strategic plan, is to be able to expand our reporting beyond just Harmony Hall.
That's interesting. Thank you for taking the time to explain that.
Okay. Just a couple of things now before we wrap up. The questions are often asked about the treasurer's role in fundraising and grant writing, and the treasurer should not be the person in charge of fundraising for a chapter. They're really both important considerations. They both require a lot of attention. They're both detail-oriented, and it's just asking for trouble to expect one person to do both of those roles and do them both effectively. So ideally, you have a person who is chasing after grants, helping to gather the information for grant applications and things like that. The important thing, though, that the treasurer can do with a grant application is to make sure that before it's filed, that the grant application is responding to the requirements of whatever organization is asking for that information. Grants are usually call for audited financial statements, but most times that can be waived by a simple phone call and explaining to them how small your organization is, and they'll accept the balance sheet and income statement that we have, especially if it's a cash basis financial statement. But you do need to check the donor requirements, because the type of information you provide, the type of not only financial information, but the background information about the chapter, where it's incorporated, how it works, all those type of things. And that's important information to make sure that you provide properly in the application. Otherwise, it'll be rejected outright. And then the grants usually have different tracking and reporting requirements based on the outcomes of the program that the grant is funding. So the follow-up on that is really important to get future grant activities. And sometimes grants have unusual things like ADA compliance for your shows. So if your show venue is an old performing arts venue that doesn't have wheelchair ramps or things like that, you might not get a grant for that type of activity if their organization requires ADA compliance, for example. So it's something that you as a treasurer can make sure as a sanity check before the grant is filed that you're fully complying with all of the information. But again, hopefully you're not doing both functions, fundraising, grant writing, or three functions, fundraising, grant writing, and treasurer's function, because it's a lot to do all of those effectively. So just a few words about what we didn't cover, although I did mention the insurance coverage. There's a required coverage for general liability, optional for property insurance. You will be getting information from the society about that. It's explained in pretty good detail. Hopefully any changes because of the pandemic will also be explained in the material that they send on that. Material that you have to help you do your job, chapter bylaws, the minutes of the chapter, newsletters from the past. If you haven't done a type of show, let's say you haven't done a cabaret show in 10 years or so, but now you want to do a cabaret show, well, maybe there's something in the history of the chapter that helps you understand the issues that you ran into the last time you did that. Or alternatively, just ask. The people on this call, the people, Dave as the district treasurer, myself as the society treasurer and the treasurer's instructor, Steve as a long-term resource for many chapters in the district. We're here to help you, and you just reach out to us and don't feel that you're isolated and need to reinvent the wheel every time a different situation comes up. So that pretty much brings us to what I wanted to cover in this relatively short session. And we'll spend as much time now answering your questions going forward. And as I mentioned, I've sent emails to all of you, so you have my email address, and you also have Dave's email address on there as well. So please reach out if there's anything we haven't covered or anything you need clarification on. But final questions.
Yeah, there was a little bit of chat on board reports and whether they are received or approved, and the concept of board legal liability and who assumes what at what point. And I know it's all in the jargon and the nomenclature, and maybe I need a little more clarification from the people that were asking this or weighing in on this. What is it that you're concerned about?
I was asking one question, which is when the year-end financial reports are reviewed, should the board then formally approve the financials? I am aware that boards rarely approve financials on a monthly basis because there's some legal liability that a board would take on by saying, yes, these are right, when they have no reason to believe that they are or not. But my question was, at the end of the year, after they've been reviewed, and before the IRS filing takes place, should the board vote to approve the year-end financials? Dave, that was my point.
Okay. This is actually covered in Robert's Rules of Order. The board of an organization approves the minutes of the organization. They approve contracts. They approve budgets. They do not approve financial statements, treasurer's reports, audit reports, if you happen to get an audit report, or the financial review report that comes in. They receive those reports because they're prepared by the people who are designated or contracted to provide those services. So the treasurer is in many cases providing that information, but it's also something in organizations that have a paid staff, for example, the paid staff would be preparing that. So that's why Robert's Rules makes the distinction between things like minutes and contracts and other things that are required to be approved versus the types of information that are needed to run the organization and provide useful information to the board to make those decisions, but are not the board's responsibility to carry out. It's kind of an arcane process, but it's the rules that almost all organizations follow. So you will very rarely hear a motion to approve the treasurer's report or a motion to approve the financial review report. You're getting a motion to receive those reports or to not even accept the reports. I mean, receive is the right word to use.
I guess, sorry, I was the one replying to Simon's chat. And yes, we were handed down. It's almost like a heretic. Lee Roth is steeped in legal procedures, and he's the one who instituted, and we continue in our chapter.
I have a question. I have a need to track expenditures by funding source. Specifically, when we have a county arts grant we get every year, and with a budget. And from 2020, we have a government EIDL loan. I need to track the expenditures of these funds for reporting purposes and just to know when the funds are all gone. I use QuickBooks. Is there a recommendation for a way to do this tracking in QuickBooks? Currently, I'm doing it offline in Excel, and it's very error prone.
I think I'm by far not an expert in QuickBooks, but I think what you're talking about is the use of the project codes. Dave, you probably are better to answer this than me.
Yeah, and I don't have the term off the tip of my tongue, but probably customer job designation would be the place to identify the source.
Yeah, in Quicken, I think you would do it through the job allocation process.
Right.
Whether that's the equivalent of that in QuickBooks or whether there's a project code that you could use.
And then you could use a class designation for the activity itself.
There's that too, yeah.
And so you could run a report in several different flavors where the customer job is tracking the source and the class is tracking the activity. And
but you're still using your basic chart of accounts. You're not adding accounts to specifically track those sources and expenditures.
Right.
Okay, I'll look into that.
I can explain what we do at Hunterdon. So yes, grants can be very tricky. They track very specific items. So some are operating only, others are capital. So you've got to work through all of those designations. So what I do is I continue providing our report the way we do, hand it over to Rusty, and he's the one who takes care of all the grant applications and management. He has a Rosetta Stone, that's his terminology. So he takes our numbers and translates it exactly into the template needed by the grantor. And it seems that works.
Yep, and then that goes back to Matt then, to make sure that everything foots properly, because that is a requirement for the general operating support. They also have grants for a project. We have not applied for one of those, but if we would, then we would come up against the question you guys just posed. For instance, let's say we applied for something for a particular youth festival, and we got funding for that. We would have to make sure that the funds that were allocated for the youth festival were appropriately spent and reported. So that's how we try and work the translation between the categorization that the Hunterdon County people want and the QuickBook accounts. And the two do have to match.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that the customer job would probably be the place to look. And you could identify your granting organization as the customer, and then each particular grant that they give as the job. So if this is a repeating type of thing that a certain group sponsors a youth program every year, you can just put the year in the title of the job and say, okay, and you could run a report on that donor or grantor, cover everything they've ever done, or narrow it to be just this specific job, this particular grant. The chart of accounts place that might show up is that you might have to put in a new bank account number. Now, this isn't a new account at the bank. This is just the Quickbooks account number that's of type bank to keep their funds. And then you would take the grant money that comes in and it would go to that account and you'd spend it out of that account. If you're concerned about spending more than you got, which is perfectly fine. Grants aren't always intended to cover 100% of expenses. But it does raise the question of what if you got more money than you used? And that's going to be in the terms of the grants, is what is their intent with that? Put over to another event next year, return it. It's all in the terms of the grant, is what are the rules you're playing by. But you might have to have a separate bank account to keep ongoing balance.
Yeah, well, Dave, following that template, if we did a perfect job, the bank account would go down to zero.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in the real world, it'll never be zero. You always spend more.
If I'm not mistaken, one of the major differences between Quicken and QuickBooks is that QuickBooks has account hierarchies. And I found this extremely useful. I don't know how I could live without it. I have Quicken for home accounting. I don't see anything like that there. Maybe I'm missing it. But bank sub-accounts are very great for this sort of thing.
Right. Because they are restricted funds. They're designated for a particular purpose, and you kind of need to account for them for that particular purpose.
Yeah, and being able to do that in the accounting software without having to set up a separate bank account is a really important time saving and expense saving, really, since most bank accounts are not free anymore. So the ability to do that in QuickBooks is an important consideration if you have that need for grant reporting or even just project reporting in general.
The trick for following through on that is in entering all of your transactions, you have to be sure to fill in all of those fields. Because as normal events, it won't prompt you to do it, and it'll probably let you get away with not putting in a whole lot of data. Unless you set up rules yourself in QuickBooks to say, don't allow this to be entered unless all of these fields are filled. Now that's a bit of work too.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, earlier in the evening, I think we were talking about the Ascap filing. I don't know, for some reason when I speak, there's a lot of background noise. A lot of us did not put on a revenue-producing show this year, 2020, and there's still an Ascap filing requirement, isn't there? I thought something said that you didn't have to file anything if there was no revenue show, but I think that the fact is you still have to file a zero form for the Ascap, right?
That's not what the Secretary's Manual says. The Secretary's Manual says if you don't have a if you do not produce your own revenue producing show, then an Ascap form is not required. Now, the Mid-Atlantic District may have a requirement that you let them know you didn't have a show so that they don't keep chasing after you, but that would be on the district's website. Since Chris Beekler is in charge of that now, I suspect that probably does exist, but I'm not familiar with it. But I know the Secretary's Manual clearly says that an Ascap report is not required when there's no revenue-producing show.
So I was going under that impression this year as well. But if you read the ASCAP form on the DHS website, this year it says even if you had a community event, no revenue, you have to file and you have to send in the required amount.
Yeah,
So that was surprising this year.
We filed an ASCAP report on Janice Bain's advice to do that, even though we had no revenue. I just checked my files, and yeah, that's what we did.
So I guess either the guidance in the Secretary's Manual is out of date, even though it was just updated relatively recently, or there's conflicting advice out there. So unfortunately, that's something that I can look into and I can get back to you on.
I'm so unaccustomed to not having a revenue-producing show.
Remember this question for the joint session next week.
Yeah, a week ago, I attended the secretary's course just because, and somebody, not the instructor, but somebody else there spoke up and said, you definitely do have to file the ASCAP even if you didn't have a revenue-producing show. Don't know who said that, but he seemed to think he knew what he was talking about.
Bruce, I was there. I remember the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'll clarify that, and we will speak to that in the joint session next week.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks. Sounds like we're winding down, John.
I think we are. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and for your commitment to your chapters to follow through on this. And I think Rob now has some final words for us.
No, just hey, thanks once again, John. Fantastic job, and thanks for the support. Your wingmen, Dave and Steve. Fantastic job, as usual, right? So we will be this being a completely virtual, event. You can't fill out your evaluation form, and fill it in by hand. I do have this week, I'll be pushing out the SurveyMonkey evaluation forms for that. I think I'm going to use SurveyMonkey. I might look around, but be that as it may, I might use a Google Forms. I've seen that done effectively as well. I'm going to send a survey out to all the attendees. Just please answer that, get that back, and then we'll incorporate any improvements we need to make going forward. Okay? So thank you for your attention, and thank you for being here. It's awesome. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Welcome to all the new folks.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.